Almighty and merciful God, we thank you for this day, especially in celebrating the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. We ask you to send your Spirit upon us, that it will be renewed within us, and it will also keep our minds and our hearts always open to your holy will, and to follow the example of the saints that you've laid before us. We ask all these things in Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Well, as we know, this is about the Protestant Reformation, and it's incredibly complex, as is most things. So I'm going to stick with the main chunks, or the main players in it. So there's about 3 or 4 of them, and then there's a lot of political stuff that's up and mixed in with it. People taking advantage of situations in order to advance their own agendas. And I'm going to stick mostly with the continent of Europe itself, because the Reformation that occurred, Reformation in quotation marks, that occurred in Britain was very, 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 very different from what happened in the rest of Europe. When this was going on in the continent of Europe, you had Henry VIII condemning them, condemning Luther, condemning Calvin, all these people. And then the defender of the faith becomes defender of his own faith. So his was a little bit different. However, all these culminated to the Counter-Reformation, which had been building up for a very long time, which led to the Council of Trent and the implementation of that, because they were seeing the problems beforehand and working on them slowly, because as we know, the church never does anything incredibly fast. So we see the cure for what was ailing the church at that moment, but then at that point they're just like, we don't want it, we don't want to deal with it. But to back all the way back up to the beginning, we're going to be starting with the continental Europe and seeing where that comes from. But oddly enough, it starts in England. As with most things, usually things start with bad philosophy or misunderstandings, and well, it starts with that always. I find it anyway. Poor philosophy and people coming to conclusions that are just like, how in the world did you get that? So it first starts off actually in England with an Oxford professor called William of Ockham. He had the idea that he did not like scholastic philosophy, which was the big thing at the time, scholastic philosophy and theology, which was basically very systematic, very, I don't want to say very scientific about it, but he was using reason to explain the faith, and also using reason to come to a greater understanding of God through philosophy. William of Ockham thought this was a little bit too much. He wanted to simplify it, he said, and in taking those complex ideas, which we know theology is incredibly complex and philosophy is incredibly complex, and the reason for that, because if you take one strand out of the entirety of that fabric of that specific tenet, then it all just starts to unravel at a certain point. So William of Ockham was looking towards philosophy as more problematic. He thought there was too many overly convoluted words, too many over-convoluted methodologies into getting to a conclusion. And so for him, he kept saying he wanted to simplify it, make it more general, which, at the moment it sounded like a good idea, because it is very complicated. If you ever look at scholasticism, it's brilliant, but it's complicated. So he went along the lines of simplifying, and I use that in quotation marks, to the point to where that instead of trying to understand God through our God-given reason, the reason we have it, is so that we can understand and explain the faith and to connect with God. So what happened with him was that he was becoming very displeased, very irritated of all this scholasticism, which sometimes could get a little bit out of hand. If you've ever been in an academic setting and people start arguing over the word is, or if you've seen presidents do that as well in the past, we won't go there. But when it came to parsing such tiny little things that seemed very minute to him, things that seemed very insignificant, sometimes which were very important, he dismissed them all and said, no, 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 no. So he wanted to separate philosophy and theology, and in fact what he did is kind of confuse them both, to the point to where he was saying that we really don't have such thing as sort of free will, and it's just God, and probably just, he didn't articulate that it was just scripture as well, but he was getting to the point of saying that empirical truths, which belong in our secular world, he was the first to start parsing that out, such as the state has certain powers, the state has certain things in this temporal world. The church and theology should have nothing to do with this stuff, should have nothing to do with basically scientific thought, scientific method, or those type of methods, or applying philosophical methods to other things for the sake of simplification. And at that point, he began, when he led to the end of his conclusion, which he came through, it ended up being that the church has to be completely separated from the state. So the king can basically, if he wanted to, take over church properties, which the king at the time was like, oh yeah, I like you. Because this was coming out of one of the greatest wars, I think it was the 100 Years' War, one of them. And the kings were looking for a way of revenue. And they were like, oh, William, come. I like you. So what's this thing about confiscating church properties, monastic properties, anything else so that I can finance my wars and all that stuff? And so that thought began to process throughout England. At a certain point, people themselves were like, this is insane. You can't be doing this. And it was just something very small. It didn't seem heretical or anything at the moment. It was just, he wanted to simplify. And then, again from England also, my countryman, and half of Father Michael. But we have John Wycliffe, not to be confused with the Methodists, but Wesley, but Wycliffe. John Wycliffe, again, he was again another professor at Oxford. So apparently there was a lot of things coming out of Oxford that weren't so hot at the moment, but anyway. So we see Wycliffe coming in, and he was speaking about how people could not own property, could not accumulate things without being sinful. So wealth is sinful. Anything you would use, you would have material-wise, would always lead to sin. It doesn't matter. And that when we took that perspective, the church should have nothing, meaning the church should not be able to have its own buildings, the church should not have any properties, even though monks needed to live and eat. The church shouldn't own things like huge libraries, the church shouldn't do this or that or the other. And like taking from William of Ockham, the church and the state should be completely separated in as much as the state can tell the church what to do. Which became one of he took Ockham's thoughts and brought them further. So now the state can tell the church what to do completely. And again, princes and kings were like, we like you, because we've got to finance ourselves. So they took up this idea of separating things and how you couldn't have anything that didn't, the idea that property leads to sin. Well, everything could lead to sin if you think about it, if you use it properly, you know that. But he, at a certain point, got to where he was attacking the sacraments themselves, because it became so to the point of like, material things are bad, anything material is bad, this, and this. And to the point also to not, I wouldn't say questioning as much as dismissing church authority on certain things, and then dismissing authority of church altogether, again saying that it should be subservient to the state. So those are two of the major people who became very much the beginnings of the thought. This is well before the Protestant Reformation, but this thought was beginning to bubble in academic circles. There's also one other called Jan Hus, who he was not from England. We have a non-Englishman. He was actually in Bohemia. So the Czech, well, we know Czech Republic, Slovakia, and all that places.
What year was this happening?
Sure. William of Ockham, oh, I had it written down here.
You spell Occam.
Ockham.
Thank you.
Before the 1400s, or at the beginning of the 1400s.
Oh, so that's back before Trent.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, this was well into the late 1300s.
Okay.
John Wycliffe was around the time of 1381, so 1380s. And with that, actually his ideas is what began some revolts in other places, because we're like, hey, we can throw off any leaders, regardless if it, regardless whether it's the church or the state. And then people didn't like him so much after that point. But Wycliffe was around the 1380s-ish time period. And then we have, excuse me, Jan Hus, who was around the early 1400s. So Hus, in his thought, H-U-S, Hus, his Jan, J-A-N, Hus. He was quite popular in Bohemia, in that area, and in the German areas. We see that he took takes from Wycliffe and Occam both, and configures it to a way that suits his way of thinking, or rather a way to justify his thinking, which was basically he proclaimed the supremacy of independent interpretations of Scripture. He also basically said the church authority was nothing, there's no such thing, and he also refuted purgatory, well he denied, I should say rather, purgatory, reserved private judgment to the person on any morals whatsoever, and rejected relics. So he was basically a full-on Protestant without the name.
I was getting ready to ask for this, Wycliffe and Occam and Hus, were they Catholics?
They were all Catholics, but they were on thin ice.
They were radicals.
Yes. They were actually, a lot of them when they spoke, they did not first espouse anything that would be considered against the church necessarily. People just thought, okay, they were just philosophers kind of getting a little bit much, like they tend to do occasionally when they get holed up in academia, which when I was a philosophy student, we used to get in horribly long conversations that last 3 years of going back and forth about topics. But these actually took it to the most extreme. Hus actually took both Wycliffe and Occam to their logical conclusion, which is basically denying almost all the sacraments because the authority of the church and the tradition were rejected, including such things as transubstantiation. And even though people supported some of them, because they're like, hey, I like the idea of not having to be beholden to the king or to the church or all this stuff, and then all of a sudden he began to attack sacraments and the theology part of it. They were like, wait a minute, no. And people started to back off, saying, we don't want to have anything to do with you. But these people weren't hauled into court or anything, because they were considered academics, and they just were spouting off. They did get themselves into trouble with a lot of the civil authorities, because when you start attacking specific aspects of authority, that also leads to, I don't have to listen to what the king or the prince or the duke says. And then that's when authority begins. When people start figuring out that they do not want to be told what to do by a hierarchy. Please give me your tax monies. I need this, raise more money. I need to feed armies. You can't take your crops. I need them because I got to finance troops. So from this we get what's called nominalism from William of Ockham, which basically puts everything in a objective formality, meaning that, well, I'll just basically read the definition for you. The theory taught that humankind can only know individual sensible objects, and that universal ideas like truth and goodness and humanity are only names. so that we can't really know anything. We can only know things through divine revelation, which he was hinting at, which led to the whole idea of my personal understanding, interpretation, and revelations with God. And from this way of thinking, like I said, it concludes with moral thoughts. And so if you lead it to the logical conclusion, it becomes in predestination, and it becomes to the point of saying, well, truth is what I make it to be. Morality is what I make it to be, is what it ends up being to. And later on, it's actually called nominalism in a philosophical sense, and it develops more. So that was the beginning. Those were the seeds that were planted, because all the other reformers sort of saw these writings and said, I can use this, and I can expand upon it. So after we have those three, we go on to the next part, which is the actual Reformation people themselves. This is the underlining quasi-philosophy / political thought / stick it to the man and stuff.
Just a point, just a question
Uh-huh.
here. This was an era in Europe which was, from a governmental point of view, very heavily monarchical.
Yes.
Almost exclusively. There were kings and queens of various countries all over the place. I recall back in my RCIA days, we went through a little history back there where one of the, of course this is the English side, the Navy Testament, was a bishop, really from Ireland. And that he was in this struggle with the monarchy of England, okay? And on one side, of course, was what the monarchy wanted, and on the other side, he saw that what we have here is a bunch of people in this area, this country, that were deprived of a lot of things, and he wanted to do something about that. And I got the impression from that one of the bases of the whole Reformation was the fact that the church ran into a whole host of monarchies, and that was one of the major reasons why the split occurred.
That's where this is kind of
talking about more about the philosophy.
Yeah,
of the church.
and that was just kind of like began it because they were talking very much about how the one authority could overthrow the other authority, or could be
Yeah,
higher.
there's a lot of this went on with this bishop.
And so that kind of planted the seeds. Now, as he was talking about, at this time period in the Middle Ages, it was not exactly the most happy time in the world. You just come out of lots of wars. You had the Black Death, plague. You had several,
Dark Ages.
many people dead, hundreds of thousands, and people literally dropping dead left and right, literally. You would have mass graves in neighborhoods because people would just be dying of plague, and then also a famine. So you had all this relegated to that. Then you add into the chaotic political situation, which the Roman Empire had fallen and it had its vestiges, which is just names and titles and stuff. So the old Roman Empire was sort of still there in the sense that it was carved up into various fiefdoms, however you want to call it, into other regions where you had dukes, princes, various feudal lords. And so they're always constantly fighting with each other over property, lands, wealth, rights, various things like that. And at the same time, they were having a situation in the church where communion priests were absolutely, they were stupid. Some of them didn't even know how to read and write. They could recite what was in the book, and that was about it. And so this was becoming really problematic. This wasn't, I'm not going to use it as a blanket issue, but it's all these little bitty things sort of add up. Some of them not so little bitty, but once we see the corrupt governments that are kind of dipping into the ecclesiastical system, meaning that my 9-year-old little nephew has now become the Archbishop of Munich or something, because my family has always been Archbishops of Munich because we belong to this family of such and such, therefore he must be this. And so we have people put into power in the church that never wanted to be there in the first place. And then two, their thought was, I'm here because I'm supposed to be basically like an ecclesial king and rule these people, versus I was called to be a priest, I was then called to be a bishop. So we have kings appointing bishops who are 9 years old, which Trent fixes. Although there's been many, there was a lot of back and forth with things like this. Yes, through nepotism, through, we see with some of the popes, in certain time periods, they received the papacy because they knew a lot of people, and they were from a very rich and wealthy family. And, which didn't mess with the apostolic succession, nor did it destroy the dispositive faith. They could care, for themselves, they could care less about that part. They had all the abilities to perform certain ceremonies, but they wouldn't do half of them. So things were safe, meaning they just like, okay guys, we can do the religion stuff, and then I can go over here and have my own stuff, my grandeur and all. So it was kind of kept in that idea. But after this point, there was basically, God sent saints. Saints basically told the Pope and the kings what for. Popes then became former monks who became monks because they were called to be monks. And that would be called the culminating reforms and all that comes from that. But that's later. But things get better.
Well, another thing that probably prior to this time, as I recall, there was one time we actually had 3 popes in the Catholic Church at the same time.
Well, there was 2 anti-popes and one real pope. So we went over a little bit of that one other time, but
I think so.
Yeah.
It's a point is that that's a point of this whole thing.
yeah, it was because people were trying to grab for power, and it had nothing to do with religion. So, because a lot of places were, I'm not really religious, I could care less, but I see this as a means to an end. I see it as a vehicle to get me somewhere powerful. Which kind of leads us now into Luther. Luther is seen as like the father of Protestantism, but he's not really, he's just the one who got the most attention. And then a lot of things sprung from that. Now, I'm not going to go over the little bitty ones that were kind of all around, we're already talking, but Luther kind of gave them the onus and the ability to kind of push their thought and agenda, which a little bit later through this, we'll realize how it got spread so fast so quickly. Okay, with Luther, he was born in Saxony in 1483, so well before anything that was going on with Occam and Huss and Wycliffe. So he's an interesting character in that basically, if you've ever read a biography of him, even Lutherans will tell you he's a bit nuts. I mean, something was not right. He had a very troubled childhood. His father was very abusive towards him. He also suffered great illnesses, mental and physical. He witnessed one of his good friends die. And also he had a couple wounds from getting into sword fights in a duel. So he wasn't exactly the most, he didn't get along with his peers. But he had a lot going against him at the same time. But when he got older, not too terribly much older, but he became an Augustinian monk. The apocryphal legend says that he basically, he was caught in a very violent storm. It was lightning and thundering, and he was scared to death. He was caught outside, and he prayed to God and said, basically, if you'll save me from this storm, I'll become a monk. Storm passed. Okay, I guess I'm going to become a monk. So that's the legend. That's not, we don't know if that's actually happened or not. But when he did become a monk, he did have horrible problems with scrupulosity, meaning that he thought he was evil to the core. He was rotten. And he thought that right after he went to confession, he immediately started sinning, could not take the Eucharist. I mean, he was very much so as well. He thought horrible of himself, and through extension, he began to think that all of humanity was the same way as he was, at least in his mind, what he thought he himself was. And he thought at the same time, this is while still he was a monk, that God is vengeful, God is angry all the time, God is always with the whole hell-bound situation. He stressed hell and damnation quite a bit, and he didn't talk hardly anything about God's mercy. He talked about the righteous, all-powerful judge, basically waiting above in heaven to smack you in the head with a cosmic mallet. You know, it was that bad for him, and it twisted him up inside. And but on the flip side, a lot of people didn't even see that in him. They saw an academic who was really good at teaching, and they didn't realize how bad it was until a little bit later in his life when he found an outlet, and then it just kind of went from there. So he was teaching in the monasteries, and eventually he started reading more in depth, and unfortunately misunderstanding the words of St. Augustine, and thinking that, St. Augustine's not really talking about the church itself, it's talking about something else. And I'm not going to go into great detail because there's a vast number of things, but all these things that were happening, he was reading his own scruples, his own issues into these writings. Like, oh, this is what it is. Usually that goes nowhere for most people. But with Luther, he was an eloquent speaker, and he also obviously had some anger issues. And the thing that kind of tipped the scale for him was that, as being, like I said before, bishops and priests were put into places of power because of who they were, not because they were deeply devoted religious people. It was because that their family knew this family, or that this family had always been this. And so if your brother got killed in war, guess what? You're now going to be the Archbishop of so-and-so. I'm 8. It doesn't matter. So you would actually get things like that happening. And so you'd have people misformed in religious thought and philosophy, and just being basically, I'm in this for money and power. So they weren't in it for glorification of God or shepherd people, was to be basically to line my own pockets and to live a life that I'm accustomed to. Even to the point where some bishops didn't even go to their diocese. They lived somewhere still in their family palaces. The Germans are bad about this. The German regions were bad about this because there was no Germany, as we know. There was several little bitty kingdoms. But Luther saw the selling of indulgences, because somebody had a bright idea. Oh, I can pay for all my things by imposing some sort of tax so that people can get penances that we can sell them. And then they will be like, oh, sure, I want this so that I can get time off of purgatory, get out of hell, whatever. Sure. So you had all these poor people coming with them with their, little they had. And he even came up with a little ditty. I don't remember it immediately, but it's basically something to the effect that as soon as your coin hits the base of the coffer's jar, a soul from purgatory is sprung. And it's like, who are you people? And I want to smack you upside the head really hard. But this was endemic. I mean, it was in pockets. Some places the clergy were exemplary and very holy men. Some places they were horribly corrupt. But at this point, the people were like, we know that priests and bishops and stuff are people, and sometimes they don't do the right things, and sometimes they are just because lack of education, and they were just told, this is what you do, and you will do it for your family. So people were kind of, they weren't happy with the situation, and they were always looking to Rome to fix it. So when Luther encountered all this stuff, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and we know about the debate he had with the 95 Theses? Yes, nailed to the door of the cathedral. In the 95 Theses? Theses? Yeah, it was nailed to the door at the Cathedral of Wittenberg in Germany. And this was not unusual. When you had a topic to debate publicly, you would post it publicly, usually on the front of the cathedral, and people were looking at it, didn't really pay that much attention to it, which he didn't like anyway. It's like, why aren't you looking at my wonderful stuff? But it was a call to debate. which this in of itself was not a big deal. This was done all over, all over the place, common practice. And so people began to debate him, and there were a couple of churchmen who, okay, I'm going to refute this person, and he probably won't be able to hold up. Most of them not realizing that he was a really, really good orator, and that he could come back with an answer with he was very good at wit, which also got him in a lot of trouble. So we had one who was debating him and was trying to point out to where these things could lead to. Okay, if you bring these to your logical conclusion, Luther, this is going to end up being getting rid of this and this and this. At this point, there was nothing heretical about what he was saying. Basically saying, get rid of this corrupt situation, this, and this, which is fine and good and what he was supposed to be doing. But what happened was that he felt that they were wrong, that he was always going to be right on this issue. And his pride began to get a little bit puffed up. I mean, Lutherans will tell you the same thing. We borrowed parts of a Lutheran seminary, and when I was in seminary, and we talked and had dialogue with Lutherans, we had beer and brats together. It was, he's like, it's good when we don't kill each other anymore. He's like, yeah, we get to drink and eat together. Anyway, we have this point, then one person debates him, and then he's like, yeah. Then he starts to think about, like, well, yeah, it does kind of lead to that. That's a good idea. Then he starts to think about that more. And then eventually what happened is a professor from Leipzig, he came in and started to debate him on finer points to try to draw out of him what he was trying to get to. So he goes into this debate. By the end of the debate, this clergyman was able to pull out of him the things that he was truly advocating for and believing in, meaning that, specifically, he had opposition to the church leadership in general, which for some reason, obviously that time was kind of bad, but then specifically very much against the authority of the Pope and the church. Then very much, he said that the ecumenical councils had no bearing on faith now. He also talked about how there is no supremacy in the Pope. Then he started going off on the Epistle of James, or the letter of St. James. He didn't like it. He thought it should be dismissed completely out of hand. And this all came up in a debate. So people are sitting there watching it, their jaws are like, okay. And people who did support him in the past, which were very notable people, you'd even have high people in political positions, other academics, even many of the humanists who were Catholic and would push the limits at times but were never wanted to leave the church. Erasmus was horrified at what he was saying, and all these people were like, okay, we no longer support you because you're insane. You have fallen greatly into heresy. Please.
This is what they told Martin Luther.
Yes, and they pulled back on all their support. So his support dwindled. And at this point, we saw what was going on, that Luther, once he espoused these things, he said, I'm not going to back down, this is what I believe. This should be removed from the Bible. I'm going to make my own translation of the Bible. I'm going to do this, this, and this. I'm going to rewrite what the sacraments say. I don't think there are really any sacraments except two. And then he went on and on and on and on. And he began to get more, again, through pride, get puffed up by some of the people who were just egging him on. And saying, you're right, this is what we do. It's like, the people are with me, why aren't you doing stuff? And then, finally, the newly appointed, actually elected, Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who was, I believe, was the first Habsburg in the dynasty, said, as he came into the throne at 19 years old, said, we gotta fix this Luther issue because I'm getting rebellions all over the empire and there's chaos. The reason that we're all over the place is because this was the advent of the printing press. Used to, this would have been a local issue and stayed local. Now, since people have disseminated through all over the place, people are like, I like these ideas, but not necessarily for the religious ideas, but for the fact that I can throw off the Pope and throw off my local king and the emperor. So Emperor Charles decides to call a diet or an assembly saying, okay, we've got to fix this now. They were having uprisings, people are dying, stop it. So when this happens, he calls Luther in and they get together, and the Pope actually calls him Rome, but a local leader, a duke actually, said, no, just bring him to my castle, and we'll have the debate here, so he doesn't have to go to Rome and we can meet halfway. So the emperor comes, a legate comes from the Pope, and then there's a big discussion and debate. Luther holds to the things that he talked about in the earlier debates about the book of James should be gone because it didn't go well with his thoughts. Faith alone, which the book of James says, faith without works is dead. He didn't like that line. And later, he kept it in the Bible, but he switched the translation because he could do it because he was translating it. Yeah. But that's another story for another day. So he was able to espouse all the stuff he wanted and was adamant that this was not, he wasn't going to have it. The people are behind me. I know I'm right. Deal with it. And the emperor was not pleased. So at least, it's like, my empire is getting a little bit out of hand. Do something about it. And at the end of this, what happened was a letter from the Pope came, a papal bull came, and said that, look, please stop this, disavow your formal thoughts, and return to the church. Luther was like, you can't tell me what to do. He gets angry, burns the papal bull, saying that you're going to be excommunicated if you continue to do this. Throws and burns it in the fire, and he gets more nasty as he goes down. He then throws it in the fire and said, this is symbolic. The Pope should be in this fire with this letter. And throws it in.